Hi, this is Tuvia Polak and I'm home. I'm in Jerusalem. I've been doing a few videos in the past where I'm at a cool place and I'm telling about it. But then, what about Jerusalem? What about my home? Well, Jerusalem is sort of amazing, so it's gonna take a while. Do you have a few hours? No. Actually, let's just break this down. I'm gonna talk today only about Jerusalem at the time of the Old Testament, and then we'll just go forward. Maybe I'll do another one of Jerusalem in the New Testament, maybe another one about later in history. But let's start from the very beginning. What you're seeing right now is Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, from the south. This is the southern viewpoint, right? So there's this typical, what do you say, like the postcard view, the very common one that you see of Jerusalem. That one is actually taken from the Mount of Olives. You have the Mount of Olives over there, and the view from the east to the Mount to Jerusalem, that's the typical postcard view that you usually see. You also have an amazing view from here, from the south, and there's another view from the north. As you can see, Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains, just like King David said. As Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains, so the Lord surrounds his people. So anyway, what I want to, and there's a reason I'm doing this from the south, because I want to show you the city of David, the Old Testament history, and you need to see Jerusalem from the south in order to do that. So let's start by going back to when Jerusalem is first mentioned in the Bible, and that's at the time of Abraham. Well, he doesn't call it Jerusalem, but he goes to Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is exactly where the temple was built later, where we now have the Golden Dome, right over there. That is the top of Mount Moriah. And in Genesis, I want to say 19, 20, 22. In 22. All right. Early the next morning, Abraham got up. Now he lived in Beersheba. That's about 3 hours drive from here. So that's 3 days of walk back in those days. So he got up early in the morning. He got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When they had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, they set out for the place God told him about. 3 days of walk. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. So 3 days later, he looks up and he sees the place. He sees the mountain from the distance. He's coming from the south, from Beersheba, so he's probably standing around where I'm standing right now, and he sees that in the distance. Now, what would Abraham see at that time? He would see none of the buildings, none of the walls, none of the towers, everything, imagine everything, just nature, except just south, small part south of Mount Moriah, of the top of Mount Moriah, there is a tiny little village called Jebus, Yevus, which is the city of the Jebusites. That's a Canaanite city. It's also called Salem a bit later, where the king Melchizedek is reigning. Abraham passes by that to get up on Mount Moriah. He probably goes around the city of Jebus. And he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. The two of them went on together. They're walking right here down this valley and up onto Mount Moriah, probably more or less around here. And this is where Isaac asks his father, the fire and the wood are here. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? We know the story. Eventually, God provides a ram and so on. Now you might say, where in the Bible does it say that this happened in Jerusalem? It says Mount Moriah. Who says that this is Mount Moriah? Well, if you go with me to 2 Chronicles 3, 2 Chronicles chapter 3, it says, Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. All right? So there's no question about it. It was right here. This is the first time this area is mentioned in the Bible. Now what happens later? The people of Israel are enslaved in Egypt. We have the Exodus of Egypt. And in the book of Deuteronomy, God tells Moses tells the people, God will decide on a place. This is where you will worship him. There's going to be a temple. There's going to be a central place of worship. No one at that time knows that that's going to be in Jerusalem. They only know that there's going to be a place that is specific, where they are allowed to worship him and do sacrifices. We have that in Deuteronomy 12, for example. Now, as they enter, and Joshua and all the conquest of Canaan, Jerusalem is hard to conquer. It's on a hill. Now, Jerusalem, we're talking about Jebus, right? It's the little town that's just south of the peak of Mount Moriah. It's not that easy to conquer. We have a story of them conquering the city of Jerusalem, but apparently the Canaanites must have taken it over, because later in the book of Judges, we have people going from the area of Judah, which is south of here, to the area of Ephraim, which is a bit north of here, and they are passing through, and they don't want to stay in Jebus because that's a Canaanite city. It's the city of the Jebusites. They don't really want to go there. It's not an Israelite city. But then we have David. Now, after King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle, King David becomes king, but only of the tribe of Judah, and he's ruling Judah from the capital of the tribe of Judah, which is in Hebron. And that's maybe an hour south of here. And when I say an hour, that's an hour drive, so it's maybe a day of walking. And at the same time, Saul's son, Ishbosheth, is taking over the rest of Israel, and there are skirmishes, there is some sort of internal Israelite civil war going on, until someone kills Ishbosheth, and the people of Israel eventually come to David and say, "You rule over us, become our king." Now, David immediately understands he cannot rule all of Israel from Hebron. Hebron is Judah's capital, and if he rules Israel from Judah, people are going to say Judah conquered the rest of Israel. The Ephraimites and the Manassites are going to be annoyed. The Naphtalites up in the Galilee are going to say, "Why are we being ruled from Hebron?" He needs a federal capital. Just like Washington, D.C. doesn't belong to any state, David needs a city that doesn't belong to any tribe. Now, Jerusalem was perfect for that because, one, there's no tribe living there, and second of all, it's right on the border between Benjamin and Judah. And Benjamin was the tribe of Saul. So if he establishes his capital there, it's going to have a lot more legitimacy as the federal capital. But that's not all. I mean, of course, we also have the religious significance of it as that it was the place where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. In addition, it's also a good place. Well, it's going to be a problem for David starting out because he needs to conquer it from the Canaanites. But once he has it, it's going to be a pretty good place to guard. It has a military advantage, and it also has its own water source. So in the book of Samuel, if I'm not mistaken, definitely in the book of Samuel, I think 2 Samuel, in the beginning of 2 Samuel, it says that King David and his people, they conquered it, they call it the city of David. Now, the area that they conquer is still only the area south that I talked about, this area that is Jebus. Hang on. There we go. 2 Samuel 5. Bible is trying to flip with me, but now the Jebusites are so sure that David can't conquer it because it's such a good stronghold. It has a higher point, and they say, "You won't get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." And they thought David cannot get in here, but nevertheless he captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. Now the word Zion, we have the word Zionism and everything comes from there. That actually comes from the Hebrew word tziyah, which is one of the Hebrew words for desert. It's not a very common word nowadays. We usually say midbar, but tziyah means desert, and it's because Jerusalem is really close to the desert. Now you can look here, it doesn't look very desert-like, but Mount of Olives, the other side of that, desert. It's like the entire Mount of Olives is like a border, a climate border. There are rain clouds that don't go over on the other side, all the way to the Dead Sea. All you have there is desert. So it's very close to the desert, but it's not in the desert. That's why it's called Zion, Zion. Now, Mount Zion, for many, many years, was just another name for Jerusalem. It's the same mountain as the Temple Mount. Much later, a hill that's a bit more to the west is called Mount Zion today. But we'll get there later. We're still in the Old Testament. Now, on that day, David said, "Whoever conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." there are all kinds of ideas about what this means, but people think that it probably means that they used the water shaft, a dug tunnel under the city of David that was used in order to get water from the outside water source in order to get into the city and open it from within. And you can still walk, if you go to the city of David today, you can walk in those tunnels. It's pretty amazing. But anyway, as long as King David lived, this little town of Jebus, Jerusalem didn't really grow. That was all Jerusalem was, this little town of Jebus. King Solomon built the temple where the Golden Dome is right now, and Jerusalem expanded to the north. And we can see how the city of Jerusalem sort of would climb upwards, where the peak would be up where the temple is. The king's palace would probably be right below it, and then the rest of the city. This is why King David could go out on his balcony and see a woman taking a bath, for example. Now, much later, King Hezekiah, a few generations after that, now we were talking about Abraham, that's the one around 1800 BC. King David, that's about 1000 BC. Now we're going a few generations further to King Hezekiah. He's in the 700s BC, and he expands Jerusalem to go a bit to our left from here, a bit to the west. Now we are still, as you can see now, the current wall are dividing between the city of David and the Mount of and the Temple Mount. That was not the case back in King David's time, of course. Jerusalem as a whole sort of moved northwards, and in later episodes we're going to talk about how that happened. But the city expanded to the left. We even have, at the time of King Josiah, there is a talk about they're going to meet the prophetess Huldah, who lives in the new city, where we can assume that that's probably in the western parts that were expanded to later. Now that was expanded to also include small parts of what is today the old city of Jerusalem. Today when we say the old city, it's the part that is surrounded by a wall, but these are much later walls. It's not the walls of the biblical times. Inside these walls, inside the Jewish quarter, you can still see a remnant of the northernmost border of Jerusalem in Old Testament time. But this is really all there was. This was the extent that Jerusalem reached in the Old Testament times. So if you look at the Old Testament, most of the Bible, big part of that was written exactly right there, right in, even outside of where the walls are today, in the southern part, in the King David, the city of David, the new area that was expanded, and of course a bit north to also include the Temple Mount. Now what happened? The Babylonians came in 586 BC. They destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, they brought everyone with them to Babylon, most of them anyway. Some were able to stay. And about a generation later, Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah. We have Zerubbabel, we have the return to Jerusalem. Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. According to what we can see, the walls that Nehemiah rebuilt more or less follow the same, it's even a bit smaller. It's basically the city of David, and including also the Temple Mount, of course. And that's pretty much it. With time, as we get into the later Persian and then later the Greek and the Alexander the Great and that area, we start to see how Jerusalem slowly starts to expand northwards as well. But that's going to be a part of the next episode when we're talking about Jerusalem in the New Testament.